this session. So we'll start by saying that I have started this research, as you know, because I'm keen to understand how museums can incorporate regenerative frameworks to transform their core functions and strategic thinking. And just before we start, I just want to make sure that you have read the whole thing, the privacy notice, participant information sheet, and that's fine. I have your consent form.
Yes, I have read that.
So that's perfectly fine. So we are going to have the conversation. And of course, if you also have questions and ideas you want to share, let me know, because they're very welcome. But I have developed some questions based on your experience. And I think you have been reflecting, doing some activities and reflections on regenerative museums for quite a while. So it's kind of different, because for some of the museums professionals, I am introducing the concept and trying to see how the practice then can be localized on the concepts.
Yes.
So in your case, I think I would like to start by asking you how you define regenerative culture, and then how you then localize it in the museum sector. In principle, how do you see the regenerative culture applied to museums? But at first, how you define it?
Yeah. Okay. So, and when you say localize, you mean situate?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I think for English speakers, maybe localize always means place, but yeah, situate. So for me, being regenerative is thinking otherwise than the dominant degenerative system of economy and culture more broadly, that that is all about, you know, where wealth and well-being is based on destroying the conditions for life on a local and a planetary scale. So a regenerative culture is about expanding the imagination to see otherwise, to see ways of living that enable Earth systems and local ecosystems to heal themselves. So that means holistically seeing places as parts nested within wholes, you know, so that's one of those key regenerative concepts, which for me is crucial, really, as a key. And it means seeing all inhabitants as expressions of life that have equal rights and responsibilities to steward the conditions to continue the expression of life. So it's this kind of endlessly cycling, you know, we exist in order to enable existence. So yeah, it's an expanded perspective. It's driven by ethics and purpose to restore and heal and nurture all of life. And I'm very interested in how that regenerative way of thinking already exists within our psyche, our you know, there's the dominant culture, but our we live around that dominant culture. Otherwise, we would just all be dead by now. You know, there's, you know, it's that wonderful tension of regenerative and degenerative in dynamic relationship. And for me, the cultural and heritage sector, museums in particular, are all about that balance, really. Sorry, you just asked me one question. How do I see regenerative culture? But yeah.
I think I did in the very beginning, but now you're entering the space of the museum sector, how it does relate to the museum sector. And also, I want to hear you of the whole idea of healing and nurturing life. What's the potential for the museum entering in that scene on this perspective?
Yeah, well, I suppose if we take the regenerative principle of nestedness, you might start you might describe that at various scales, right from the micro to the macro. Because though the Earth crisis is so significant, we have to start at the big scale, the macro scale of seeing the whole crisis and having a triage response, an emergency response. So it's tempting for museums to start small because their business is dealing with small things, really, dealing with things and dealing with localities. But it's really important that we actually start at the scale of acknowledging the impact of and tackling the Earth crisis. So, at the very big scale, we need to do what's necessary to sustain civilization and the agents for civilization that include museums. And then working downwards to work in bioregions for a more regenerative economy and resilience, community resilience, and then working, locally and then relationally, supporting work even at kind of neighborhood and street level, but also, restoring ecosystems. I mean, this is just, this is maybe like a general sort of formula for any organization, any civic organization, whether they're museums or not, that they need to plan their action in these nested ways that triages, resilience in the face of emergency impacts, then starts to work on how we might change systems in order to change, to mitigate the Earth crisis. But yeah, so for me, the particular role of museums in that is actually about navigating that that micro to macro. There's a way that museums have of being able to create contextual stories and help people understand relationships and nestedness and time and place, the crossings of time and place and culture.
And just picking up this idea of restoration of ecosystems, do you think this, because you mentioned that this framework of regenerative thinking and the nested systems could be developed and applied to any type of organization, not only to museums. But is there a particular function that you see for museums there? And I just want to give you an example. I was in a conference recently that I mentioned this idea of the museums, the need for museums to restore ecosystem. And someone just told me, but museums will not do reforestation. Museums are not going to plant trees. It's not their function. So I want to hear your reactions about if there is something specific for museums in ecosystem restoration, or how do you see this in comparison to other types of organizations?
Yeah, it's a really interesting challenge, isn't it? And it's one that you might put to any kind of business. If a business is about making toasters or printing books, you might say to them, what's your role in restoring ecosystems? And they might say, well, that's not what we do. We make books, or we, make toasters. But the question needs to flip. The first question should be, how are you going to sustain the conditions for life on the planet, because they are totally and utterly breached and threatened? That has to be the first question to any coming together of any group of people. And the more that people concretize their coming together in a sense of purpose or structure, even more important that the first question has to be, what are you doing to sustain the conditions for life on this planet? So if the most obvious thing for a book manufacturer is to plant trees, and it sounds like it should be, then if we apply that same model to museums. If it's a natural history museum and they're doing live ongoing research into species of life, then in addition or as part of their research, they need to be doing it, changing the conditions of their research so that they're focusing less on the parts and more on the wholes. So, for example, if they've got a project that's about forests in Ecuador, how are they using their cultural and systemic knowledge to enable the defense of that land, as well as being able to count the number of a certain type of butterfly? So it isn't just about planting trees, it's about, multiple things that are necessary to defend, protect, and nurture land. And the same with, for example, industrial heritage museums. Say it's a museum of whaling, a museum that has material that is to do with whaling heritage. They need to do everything they can to raise funding for, the protection and legal rights of whales and other marine species, not resting on this simple story that whales have been saved, because that's a classic story in the natural history world. They display a whale and call it hope because, whaling has been banned. But the impacts of the climate crisis and ocean acidification and increasing deep sea mining and the increasing size of ships and deep bed, ocean bed trawling and sonic booms, all of these things are making it much, much harder for whales to thrive. So you can't just rest on a single legal. What I'm trying to say is that all of these multiple things that can be done, the role of a museum is to expose all of those things that can be done to help people make decisions about what to do and to enact them and to potentially research the benefits and the effectiveness of those combined actions. So, just to kind of summarize, the challenge is a helpful one, but the point is that museums don't necessarily have this direct role of going out and planting a tree, but they do have an active role in helping people know what to do and know what's effective.
In order for us to have trees out there, which may not mean actually plant the trees, but catalyze initiatives that we'll do. Can I just excuse myself to close this window? Just 1 minute.
Yeah.
Very, very noisy. Okay. I think you touched on some of the living principles when you mentioned, of course, nestedness and the notion of place and how this is so important for the regenerative culture when we're thinking on implementing living systems principles. But I have been wondering how you would think and where the living principles can actually be applied and implemented on the daily work of museums on their core functionalities. And by saying this, because I think you are very familiar to the concepts of nodal, reciprocity, holiness, development, to be a project that developed the region and the people at the same time. But my question is, on the daily work of museums planning and doing and programming and doing their strategic planning, where these living principles do you think they could sit and how they could work in museums' functionalities?
Well, thereby lies a book, doesn't it? I mean, that's it's enormous. I mean, I start with, I want to do the same and shut my window. It's suddenly got cold. Hold on.
That's fine.
Yeah, so it starts with knowledge. It starts with museums being the place where expanded thinking is possible. So and museums have a kind of abstraction from life in a way automatically, that they are, their objects and stories are taken from out of life and put into some kind of a human-centric structure. But as such, they can help us think about the living systems that these things come from. But museums could be more biophilic. The design of museums and their experiences could be much more representative of those living systems, drawing from them overtly. And when I mentioned, yes, of course, museums don't really plant trees. Why not? Why not have a living tree at the center of an exhibition or something, as a symbol of what's possible. I think that, and also, because museums help us see and understand, they help us see the degenerative and they help us see the potential for the regenerative. So, to be able to help people to know and feel the harm of the dominant system, the destructive, the colonial consumer culture that has accelerated and damaged our world, to feel it, to feel the loss, to empathize with the loss, to enable us to feel the potential species loneliness, and to really empathize with people who have lost their habitats and been displaced. And in a way, that's not quite the sort of lovely, hopeful, let's all create a regenerative world. But this is the point, I think, that museums have the role to show us what has been lost and to build an appetite for what we want to create. So, the first principle really is this question: what will you do to create the conditions conducive to life, or to sustain life on this threatened planet? So, that question goes to the organizations themselves, and then it goes out to their audiences and partners. What are we going to do to create the conditions conducive to life? What is this space, all of these objects here for right at this moment? They are here because our destiny right now is to act urgently to, yeah, you know what I'm saying. And then I think, the second thing is about the interconnectedness and nestedness of life, and helping people to understand how life works. And therefore, so you start with that purpose. What are we going to, we are going to do something to create conditions conducive to life. The next step is to enable discovery and knowledge about the nestedness and interconnectedness of systems, and to use collections to do that. And also, so museums then have often this authoritative role, or they're like a forum for communities. They bring people together, and they enable collaboration. And quite often people will come into a museum with a sense of value. They know that these things have been considered valuable. They might come with a critical feeling of, these were stolen from me, or these represent rich people. But you start from a positive place where there's a sense of value and potential for an increase.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that is those are the conditions conducive for partnership and collaboration.
One of the things, I mean, sorry, did you finish this part? One of the things that the authors and practitioners from regenerative culture that I understand that they have done for practical projects is to help these organizations and professionals to relearn how to be regenerative. Because we all know it's a principle of all living beings as we are, but we need to be reawake for these principles. And we have to enter in a journey of relearning how to apply in projects. So the Regenesis group, Carol Sanford, and all the authors and people who have applied regenerative culture to territories, to cities, to architecture, they had to bring these professionals to the mindset of the living principles and then ask them and invite them into a journey. Do you think museums professionals would be willing to enter in this journey of accepting a new framework, a new way of thinking to their strategic thinking?
I mean, yes, I think many of them would feel a huge sense of relief and purpose and joy in doing that. And many are already sort of starting out on that journey, but maybe without a conscious or structured pathway, because so far nothing quite exists to help them. They would be challenged by lack of space, support, funding, you know, so the willing would be there, but the capacity would be missing in many cases. I would also say that in order for it to be successful, you might need to mix people from, you know, a wider cultural sector, so including natural and built heritage, industrial heritage, and not just the you know, accredited museums. Yeah, I think it's a hugely valid thing that would really, really help people, because it would fill a gap at the moment. I think people are struggling to find areas of professional development that are deeply nurturing on multiple levels, you know, the nested thing again, and I think the Happy Museum project began to do that, but maybe without informed use of the regenerative principles. It started very much from, you know, there were multiple themes like, you know, well-being, citizenship, you know, citizenship and democracy. So it had multiple themes and principles that weren't nested or integrated. So yeah, that's
maybe in a similar intention, but it's still fragmented. What I hear.
Yeah, and it meant that people chose their own theme, or you know, chose a little part rather than the whole.
I think I'm going to invite you to step back a little bit, and I really would like to hear your perspective on the differences between sustainability and sustainable development in the museum sector.
Oh, I'm not really sure that I have a strong understanding of the difference between the two.
Maybe I can bring you a prompt.
Yeah.
In your article, the sustainability is in the past. You argue that sustainability was about business continuity, reducing harm, and somewhat to minimize risks such as reputation damage, fines or litigation or waste of resource. However, now I argue that some professionals working with sustainable development through the Sustainable Development Goals framework, they believe that sustainable development is about working to be more good and do less harm. But you bring a different perspective on that. And what I want to hear first from you is, first, the difference between sustainability and sustainable development, if that's not so clear, and then we can enter the idea of the difference between sustainable development and regenerative development. So that's, I just want to ask you the mixture of perception in the museum sector of those concepts,
Yeah,
progressing from sustainability, then sustainable development and regenerative development.
yeah.
What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, it's a while since I read this article, yeah, it's a year old or so. Um, I yeah, I think just reflecting maybe on what I perceive in the sector, sustainability is generally about mitigating harm. It's about yeah, technical, practical steps, manageable steps that have dual outcomes of essentially saving money and mitigating environmental harm. So it's seen as, the triple bottom line of, it will help us with our bottom line of money. It will help us with our, reducing environmental impacts, and by engaging with people around these activities, we contribute in some way to social sustainability. But the bottom line is often more about reputation than it is about genuine, authentic change. So sustainable development, or particularly being inspired by or working towards the sustainable development goals, is enabling this expanded perspective. It enables perhaps a more ethical mindset, because it makes you think about what do our communities need, and what does our wider world need from us. And then, I, yeah, we are starting to see a lot more storytelling in museums around environmental issues and sustainable development stories in the last 5-6 years. But what we're not seeing is collapse responsiveness, or even collapse awareness. And this is where I take issue even, with the sustainable development goals, because they're very much a compromise, being a sort of global system. They've been, negotiated and arrived at by committee, and the fact that it includes economic growth is a real problem, because again, if you take a holistic, quite often you see advice. I mean, very often the typical approach to sustainable development goals is to pick one. And it's this, partial, fragmented approach where, pick one, and you might focus on economic growth, or and rather than seeing them as nested and interrelated. And what they should be is a structure that enables us to respond to collapse, and it should be a triage of actions where, the very first thing that we do is to ensure that people and species are protected, or that there are and that we are, as museums, helping communities or institutions and professions plan for this emergency response, and then, to do what we can to change the system to a regenerative one. So yeah. And at the moment, everything is just far too, most museums are still stuck in the first horizon of business as usual. And then but they are often a platform. So their structures and their management is stuck in the first horizon, business as usual. The second horizon of innovation and human imagination is what they exist to platform. They define their value as being about disrupting business as usual, or you know, showcasing how humans have changed things. You know, here's a hero who, you know, a social change hero who changed things, and or an artist, you know, who used their personal imagination. So that's the second horizon. And there's no concept in general, I think, of the third horizon. Not, you know.
I was wondering if you could give an example of what you recall to be a sustainable development practice applying museum, and another one of a regenerative development practice. Does it come to your mind now? Let's say 2 examples, one of each.
Just let me find a place where I've been collecting some examples, and I can remind myself.
Yeah.
Hang on. I mean, I tend to collect examples of public engagement, you know, because that's my focus. So I suppose the perfect example of sustainable development would be the, I mean, it's obvious, the UN Live Museum, because they exist as a museum of the Sustainable Development Goals. That's what they do.
You mean the UN Live Museum? Sorry.
Yeah, UN Live Museum. Yeah. Which is a bit like with Climate Museum UK, you might say that's not really a museum, you know, it's more of some kind of a digital project, or, you know, with you know, live experiences in places. But they exemplify what I'm trying to suggest is a key role for museums, which is, you know, public engagement around the big changes that are needed, and solutions. And also, you know, they really do excellent work on platforming the voices of people in what you might call developing nations and climate impacted nations and communities. So I think they are, you know, really ethically exemplary, and showing museums how to use technologies and conversational methods to respond to, you know, and to explore these sustainable development goals. But moving to another example, I think all of the examples I can think of are still sort of still in sort of Horizon 2, but maybe gesturing towards Horizon 3. So
what do you mean by Horizon 2 is sustainable development?
Yeah, hang on. In the 3 Horizons framework, I'll just
okay, no, that's fine. Now
I should probably, for the sake of your recording, just kind of spell out what I mean. That yeah, and to be clear for myself as well, that Horizon 2 is about doing things differently, whereas Horizon 3 is, let me just look it up, is about moving towards a viable future. It's that, you know, how do we create the conditions conducive to life? And in a context of breached planetary boundaries, that isn't just something to hold on the distant horizon. It's something to bring forth now. You know, it's been developed as a foresight tool. It's been around, the 3 Horizons framework has been around for about 16 years, maybe. But for too long, we've still been sort of dancing around with it and not bringing in that viable future and prefiguring it and making it happen now. Yeah.
Okay, so if you want to go back to your example that you were mentioning, moving from Horizon 2 to Horizon 3,
Yeah. So I'm trying to think. I mean, this is where more research is needed, and I know that that's why you're doing this. But I think the struggle is real, isn't it? To find, yeah. But I mean, the smaller the museum, you know, the more likely they are to be thinking in these experimental ways, but to have very little resources to expose and develop their thinking. I suppose the Natural History Museum is an exciting example. They declared a planetary emergency when we asked 5 years ago. I went with a group of young people and families. We asked them to declare, and they did. And then, you know, creating advocates for the planet is their core mission. They are, you know, a research institution as much as a public attraction, and because of that, they're honest. They use the title "Our Broken Planet." So this thing about showing what's wrong, showing what's broken, you know, using the museum platform to honestly show what is broken and harmed. They're doing that. And they're supporting a whole range of international networking and research sharing that is, yeah, I would say that they are collapse aware. Because they're aware of collapse happening in ecosystems, if not in, you know, if not in human societies, at least they're aware of what can go wrong in the wild.
Yeah, and I think this relates to my next question in terms of frameworks, because when I look at your framework of the idea of culture takes action, the response after declaration, when we look at this column, the change making, which is regeneration thinking, you mentioned the whole idea of keeping a relationship with community for further action and long-term thinking in terms of a bigger picture, and how the organization will actually practice the declaration. So let me move to this next question, which is about frameworks. Because I have been specifically looking to how thinking on museums and the way they operate, if we have frameworks to support them in this journey, it could be helpful. So I was going to ask you if you have seen in the book, a recent book, that there is an article that you published with Victoria. There's another article from the director of the, I think it's Felipe's Conservatory and Botanical Gardens.
Yeah.
From Richard Piacentini.
Yeah.
And he has exposed some of the regenerative frameworks that they have applied there, which are basically some of the Carol Sanford, she systematized them, of course, it's Regenesis group also, in terms of the 3 lines of work, the whole idea of the living system stakeholders, the law of 3. And I think it was very interesting to see how they have done it. But on the other side, and at the same time, you have developed specific frameworks. So I have looked at the Earth Crisis Blinkers, the post-utopian futures, culture takes action, response after declaration, the whole matrix of truth-telling, caretaking, change-making. I think they are also helpful. My question to you is, in terms of frameworks, do they relate? Do you feel that what you have created in terms of framework somehow relate to regenerative frameworks? What would you see in terms of how they dialogue to each other?
I think that's my next step, isn't it, really? I'm slightly wary of creating this kind of ultimate machine. I don't know. I tend to sort of like, I tend to be a bit more like flowers or mushrooms popping up, you know, like, oh, here's a whole new idea and here's another one. But maybe the next step is to actually go, right, you know, I've been working so hard on what's wrong. Maybe I need to really work hard now on how to help people understand how we do good, how we do it better. I could have a good old look at what I've done and say, well, there are definitely some common principles throughout everything, having the expanded perspective, understanding connectedness, being driven towards healing and restoration, and also the human side of things, you know, being compassionate and intersectional. Yeah, and maybe, you know, maybe there are things missing in the sort of living systems frameworks or regenerative world that it doesn't really learn enough from culture. You know, maybe there's something in the cultural sector or the heritage sector that could enrich those frameworks. Maybe that's an exciting area to look at. You know, in how we change the story. I think that whole area, that whole space is dominated very much by the marketing sector, the notion of climate messaging or, you know, simplifying the story, rather than, you know, enabling people to be peaceful together.
I think specifically about these frameworks that you created, I was interested in hearing if you have applied them to specific museums or arts organizations, arts and culture. How was that received? How was that applied? Can you give an idea of experience that you had by applying them?
Yeah, so just a few examples. I worked with the Horniman Museum a year and a half ago. They have a project called Nature Plus Love, which is it's the sort of overarching name for their development project. And I worked with the learning team to develop some principles for nature plus love, nature and love. So I went through some of these frameworks, you know, the Earth Crisis blinkers. I can't even remember what I actually took them through. I tried to make it very simple and not too overwhelming, but still they found it quite overwhelming. And it wasn't a long enough process either. You know, it was very brief. I'm just looking at it now. The principles that we arrived at were connection, action, access, perspective, care, and hope. I will probably, you know, that was from them more than anything, after we went through a sort of discovery process. Yeah, that's right. We looked at the Earth crisis in a historical context. We looked at the idea of being pluricentric and what that means, how it's about integrating the anthropocentric and ecocentric, you know, and that again is a great principle for museums that are about that crossing of humanity and nature. So yeah, being pluricentric. Yeah, what I think what happens sometimes, what happens always, is that nature connection is the big way in. People feel like being more nature connected is the way to engage people and the way for themselves to cope with this big crisis. So the big theme that came up in that conversation was about paying attention to the familiar, ordinary, small, hidden aspects of nature, seeing it close by and how it all connects. So it was like that just keeps coming up over and over again, not just in the Horniman, but in many groups that I work with. And problematizing that would be to say nature is in trouble. if we connect with nature, we also need to notice that it's in trouble and to be, to grieve for what's lost and to actively help. So being nature connected is about so much more than just forest bathing or finding a wild place that is still quite intact, having a holiday in it, and then, so museums can't act as a kind of a fake world of, this is a little bit of a sort of nature excursion, or, it has to be about helping people really connect with nature authentically by understanding how it's being harmed and lost and what we need to do to steward and restore it. So, this is always the challenge. It's the push. It's the third horizon, really,
Great.
Yeah.
What I think I could do as well, I will share with you this questionnaire. And if you come across other examples that you want to send, and then you can do this afterwards, but this is
Yeah.
very helpful.
Yeah.
And your point about maybe the regenerative frameworks could have a much more cultural mindset applied to it. I think one thing that you mentioned now about nature reminds me that regenerative frameworks are very much based into bringing nature's priority and inviting us to design as nature. And this is a challenging invitation for Anthropocene area. So that's why I think I shouldn't say what I think, but just because we are talking, I think a lot of it is about how we bring this desire for us learning to design as nature closer to where we are now, and help us to build this pathway of relearning how to be nature. And I think some of your frameworks dialogue with this invitation.
Yeah.
To go in this journey, and I think this is interesting to look into regenerative existed frameworks and what you have created as a possibility of potential interactions that can learn both sides, both frameworks.
Yeah, I think that regenerative frameworks can be criticized for being unpolitical or apolitical, and for not bringing people with them, not acknowledging that people are hampered by power relationships. When I talk about regenerative principles or culture in, for example, local activism groups, I get pushback with, people won't understand that, or what about, people who care about jobs or can't think like that, or it's all very lovely, but, it's that sort of, because the regenerative culture world is seen as coming from the set aside movement, nature conservation, rewilding, taking land away from people. So I think there's a challenge in humanizing it and showing how it corresponds to the just transition and climate justice. So for me, that is a challenge, kind of rehabilitating it in the socially oriented cultural sector, because the cultural sector generally comes from the left, and well, yeah, it comes from, revealing and celebrating the people's history. It certainly does in the UK anyway, which is seen as opposed to those who care for land, which is farmers. Sort of, we have that tension in the UK. It's probably very different in Brazil or other places, but
Very good.
but it is a tension in sustainable development world, of course, as well. That tension between sustainable and development, because development is seen as human, economic, and sustainable is seen as environmental. And some people think it's an oxymoron and you can't bring them together.
Okay, let's see if we can bring together regenerative and development. I want to bring back the discussion about places and the idea that we can only heal places, and by doing it place by place, we may heal the planet. I just want to see how I frame this question, because I'd really like to hear your experience about the bioregionalism in museums. So I think in your article, Museums and Bioregionalism, you mentioned the importance of museums and cultural organizations who work with bioregions to accelerate an effective response to emergency, allowing change makers to break down global issues to a local level and then create accessible pathways to active involvement, which you mentioned at the beginning of the interview. But I want to hear you, what new perspectives can the bioregional lens bring to museums curatorship, education, and community work?
Yeah, again, you know, one of the challenges in understanding this is that bioregions are quite vast, aren't they? You know, they're almost as big as countries sometimes, or bigger. And museums tend to work in a way that they think they engage people on a much more local level. So much more in terms of civic pride, or a very kind of, you know, hyper-local thing like this particular spot on the river, or, you know, and I think this is the thing, that we're not used to thinking in terms of geological diversity. You know, the natural history sector represented in museums, on the whole, engages us by talking about species, because it comes from that very sort of taxonomical mindset, but we don't have any public discourse about geological diversity or geological health. So in getting people to think bioregionally in terms of, you know, what is beneath our feet, and the sort of, you know, seeing landscape in a layered way, and not just as a flat expanse of land that can be owned. It's such a challenge. And so you know, nobody has commented on my article really much, apart from Daniel and you know, there's been no discourse around it. It's just seen as a very niche idea. And what there is starting to be interest in is systemic place-based change, or the role of the arts in place-based change. But that's, again, incredibly anthropocentric. Place is seen as, you know, places that used to have industry and don't anymore. It's like, you know, there's almost no other way of seeing place. Used to have industry, culture can regenerate them. Culture can bring in tourism and a new kind of industry. And in doing that, we mustn't leave people behind, because on the whole, people are not that interested in culture. That is the standard Horizon 1 and 2 narrative that we're dealing with. And so how do we enable a perspective which is expanded, bioregional, much more about, you know, nested systems, with bioregions being a key sort of operating principle? Well, God, I don't know. We need a funded project. You know, we need awareness raising, professional development. Yeah.
We'll get there on the question about professional development, but I want to ask if you get stories of projects that you actually have seen bioregionally thinking happening in museums. And also how you then look into if there are differences of bioregional and bioculture principles. I mean, I could hear your stories from both sides because they do have intersections, but they also have differences. but do you have any story of a project that comes to your mind?
Well, I don't know what they're doing lately, but the Cataran Eco Museum is a museum for that ecological region. Also, Tully House in Carlisle is at the centre of the Lake District, which is, has a very strong identity as a geological region. It's a region of extraction and tourism, and it's mining, graphite mining, farming, and tourism. And so the museum reflects that heritage. It's a landscape heritage more than an industrial heritage, if you see what I mean. So museums in places like Manchester or Liverpool are more likely to reflect a kind of heritage that is based on a technology rather than a landscape. So like the
Similar
textiles.
to Derby.
Yeah, exactly. The textiles industry grew up because of imported, colonial materials, and so it was, reflective of globalization. Whereas somewhere like the Lake District is all about the heritage of Ruskin, John Ruskin, who in the Industrial Revolution travelled to places like the Lake District and said, look at this geological diversity. Look at what's being lost as we extract from the landscape. Let's respect this, this beauty, and our art should cherish this kind of beauty. So the Tully House Museum is really keenly aware of that crossing of art and nature, and they've done projects. They did a collaborative project with us, I should say. We worked with them for a year or more. I did 4 training sessions. We recruited an artist in residence called Megan Bauer, who did a whole range of archival experiments, and she created an exhibition. Well, they were creating an exhibition with young people, and she created a part of it. And it was a great example of, far-reaching regenerative thinking. Yeah, that's probably the best example I can think of that I know about. I don't know that we used the word bioregion strongly,
And
but
how
it's
do you, sorry,
sub-bioregion. Yeah, it's a geological region.
and how would you then define the bioculturalism applied to museums?
Well, yes, that is interesting. I think the more sort of rural life museums are quite interesting with that. The Museum of English Rural Life in Reading, that's been part of the Happy Museum network, and that's been exploring. I don't know enough about their recent work, and possibly they've not been doing enough lately. They could do more. So there's the Food Museum in Stowmarket in Suffolk. That's a rural life museum. Because they've started focusing on food, I think that they've probably got a lot of exciting potential, to be thinking more about that human relationship. What's the future of food? How has our extractive relationship with land led us to where we are? There's also the Weald and Downland Museum, where I was doing that eco-lens training the other day. But again, I would say that there's just potential to be exploring these relationships. They're very focused on the technology of buildings, or the technologies of, like, how did, it's the progress narrative. How did we get better and better at building houses that withstand weather, and, rather than how did we get better and better at sustaining the conditions for biodiverse life? That story is rarely told.
Interesting. There are good correlations between what you bring on the rural museums and the eco museums in the global south. I think it's something that we could also look at. I think I'm gonna move now about how we build capacity within the workforce of museums. The whole idea of bringing museums professionals to see this potential. So many of the climate Museum UK actions have been aimed at expanding eco-literacy and an ecological lens on people's lives, works, and also museums. I want to hear from you what barriers in the museum sector that prevent this from happening, and also the effective pathways that have been proven effective or perhaps well received by the museum community.
I feel I would need to do a lot more data gathering before I could give a very comprehensive reply on the impact of that training. Just a little comment on eco-literacy as a term. I tend not to use it because I want to develop eco-capacities that include literacy. However, most of the training, because of its constraints and shortness, has had to be much more about eco-literacy than the wider range of capacities I'd like to see developed. And the wider range of capacities includes the spiritual, do you remember the wheel? Yeah, the medicine wheel, you know, the spiritual, the physical, and emotional, and not just the intellectual, which is about eco-literacy. But in the training sessions, we do try to include expression of emotion. You know, how do you feel about this overwhelm? How do you express it with art? How do you help people deal with the psychological reactions? So, you know, we do try to expand beyond just that sort of scientific knowledge. Yeah, that's the one.
Yeah.
Yeah, eco capacities. But literacy is a part of it. I'm not excluding it. So in terms of the barriers, well, you know, one of the barriers is that we can't do a full holistic program because we only have time to go, you know, here's this huge problem. Here's what's wrong. You know, how do you feel about it? What are you doing? What could we do in your museums to do something about it? And it's just not, you know, it needs a year-long training program, needs a journey where you spend a really strong amount of time in exploring tactics and regenerative pathways. And so the barriers occur during these training sessions when people go, this is overwhelming, I haven't got time for it. We haven't got time for it here now in this session. This isn't my job. My museum doesn't see this as its job. Do you see, you know, it's the barriers happen at every level. Emotional, cultural, financial. But at the same time, people are generally enthused about the potential, and they see that, you know, very often people do follow up by doing activities, and I don't know if I can lay claim to any of it, but I'm seeing a huge explosion in practice. You know, there's so many more examples. It's becoming so much more normal to do public programming on environmental themes.
Yes, and actually I have looked at the eco capacities, and you include many emotional and spiritual elements to it. Which sometimes when you look at the mindset of museums professionals and the culture of the sector could prevent this work to flourish in a direction that could be really regenerative in terms of the whole idea that regenerative leadership, it's about self-development. as you know, in terms of looking at our own shadows and willing to bring life to things that can be devoted to regenerate us as much as we want to regenerate the territories and the projects we want to work with. So the question to you is about how is the receptiveness of the museum's professionals of emotional and spiritual elements that are in the framework?
I don't think that I've fully tested it, because I tend to advertise what I do as, you know, helping you grasp or understand, helping you think about how to engage with your particular target audiences. You know, I'm using the language of management and marketing and education more than I'm using the less acceptable management language of what's seen as alternative cultures. You know, many individuals that come to these trainings or that I meet in this world are yearning for it, or they're practicing it separately in other aspects of their lives, usually through, you know, sort of yoga type practices, or
mindfulness,
or travel, or, you know, that sort of thing. Sorry, mindfulness. Yeah.
mindfulness.
Yeah. But and you know, we're a deeply pragmatic culture in this country, and most of my experience is within the UK. But I have done training that's interesting to compare with Scandinavian countries, but they're still very similar, really. You know, it's very pragmatic, very much. The environment is seen very much as, you know, a technical problem, and a sort of balanced problem of how do we meet the needs of people and jobs and economy, while also ensuring that our environment is safe into the future. It's that, rather than how do we love and cherish each other and other species in our land. There's much more acceptance of it in the arts sector than there is in the museums and heritage sector. And of course, there's a huge overlap, you know, but individual practicing artists are so much more open to that. And sometimes they come to my training sessions and bring that aspect into them. And quite often they won't work in institutions in salaried jobs, or they don't want to, because they don't want the spirituality of their practice to be squashed. So yeah, it's, yeah, you know, basically people don't want to be accused of being, when I say it's a very pragmatic culture, what I mean is that the culture is quite conformist. You know, it's quite a it's always been in the UK a very performative. You know, you have to do as you are, as others do, you know. We have a lot of eccentrics in our culture, but they're only noticed because we're so conformist. It's kind of like we're so conformist that some people break out and go weird and go alternative. We don't really embrace diversity here, and so therefore we don't really embrace that sort of you know, the expression of individual sacredness. It's very embarrassing to make any kind of statement about the sacred or one's values. It's really awkward for people to do that. I've gone on too much. I'll stop now.
No, that's fine. That's fine. It's an important reflection.
Yeah.
On lots of regenerative authors understand that this is a sacred work, and maybe it could be not be understood for everyone who is practicing regenerative initiatives, but for some, it's intentionally doing sacredness as well. So it's very good comment. there are two final questions, and this next one, it's about when you respond to Daniel Wahl piece on the cultural institutions and regenerative cultures, and your responses were very well structured in a way that inspired us of thinking of what is the major contribution that cultural institutions can actually give to regeneration. Because all the discussions of regenerative culture on this research, it's about providing a framework to museums to help with social and environmental issues. But now I'm bringing a different question. It's how museums can actually contribute to a major regeneration challenge that we have. So you mentioned, I can remember what you said. So cultural organizations with global outlook should focus their energy on ending an extractive culture, prefiguring a regenerative culture, and enabling well-being in a time of collapse and mass extinction. So pushing to a more radical thinking, maybe. So if we assume, and I think I want to ask you that we still have a chance to create new potential futures, because with all the collapse, sometimes people are losing hope as well. So let's assume that we can still create new futures. What do you believe should be the core actions that museums can do to support a wider regeneration movement that extends beyond the museum sector, but it still maintains its distinctive qualities?
This question about hope is it's a rabbit hole, isn't it? You know, that you can go down. And so for me, it's not really an either or, that you can either focus on dealing with collapse or being hopeless about collapse and just sort of like surviving collapse. There is no alternative but to survive by creating the conditions that are conducive to life. Do you see what I mean? Like it's not like there are these multiple pathways we can go down, one of which is to just, you know, focus on how desperate everything is. So it's this idea that I keep coming back to of triage. You know, you first of all put in place protective plans. You secondly ensure that you are constantly working towards a regenerative future, and the two together are you know, hopeful. It overcomes the notion of despair. It's like, you know, you act, and that's what matters. Anyway, I've probably got distracted from the question now.
But this is very important. As you know, we are through a major collapse in Brazil, in the region of the south, the Rio Grande do Sul. And there are lots of group of discussions about how the collapse there, of course, the waters invade the arts institutions, and they're very shocked by the collapse. And as you said, they cannot be hopeless. So they're creating a new committee to think about the Emergency Act and the future of how they want to react for future collapses. And the Ministry of Culture is involved, and the network of arts institutions are involved. And at the moment, what really matters is acting. I mean, lots of people last week were expressing their hopeless, but now they're acting.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
just want to reflect a little bit on what you thought, because I do think it's important, and I think it's not diverting from the question. I think it's part of the question.
Yeah. I mean, museums themselves are threatened by those kind of, you know, emergencies, but there are still many thousands of museums worldwide that are still able to operate. You know, it's a trans apocalypse. You know, the destruction and harm is happening in slower or faster ways in, you know, all over the world. And always there's going to be, you know, there are going to be pockets and places where people can come together in safety and peace, where we can access knowledge from the past. And so, yeah, we do have to prioritize, but then in each situation, do what's right for that. Some situations are not going to be threatened. So those are the places where we can take a longer view, a more, deep, maybe think more about deep time. It might not be appropriate to do that where people are more strongly threatened, or heritage is more at risk. So yeah, it's about getting it right. So quite often I do come up with these lists, categorizing the whole picture and making these very general statements. But I really don't want to leave out the sense of collective responsiveness to emergence and emergency, the actual diversity of practice happening in places to protect and rebuild and to prevent, prevent, protect and rebuild.
Perhaps going back to the question, do you think there is a unique thing museums can do for the major regeneration movement?
Yeah, well, being part of it, not just seeing, us as a separate sector that needs to defend its value. So, swallowing pride a bit and going into spaces where people are talking more about things like the things that you might not understand, like food or geology or, economy, going with curiosity, going to learn, advocating, to managers and boards that this is important and that time and space is needed for it, that it encompasses everything, that if we can all train in developing regenerative mindsets, we can also tackle those problems of exclusion, the cost of living crisis, all of these things that are seen as overwhelming issues are actually small parts of the bigger problem. So, yeah. Yeah, I think the role that museums can play is in being like telescopes in a way. It's like we can, we are observatories or ways of seeing the whole, ways of seeing the bigger picture, ways of seeing the past and the future. Yeah, creating a sort of thicker now and a thicker we. Yeah.
Great. I think the last question, I have asked you before about regenerative development initiatives, but do you think we can already recognize regenerative museums that you would look at and say, wow, this is the seed for a regenerative museum? Do you have an example that comes to your mind, or that, I mean, you mentioned some, but I'm just trying to see if you say, I think this museum, it's really going to a route of becoming a regenerative museum, or it is a regenerative museum.
Yeah, it's difficult, isn't it? Because you could say all museums are more regenerative than the other forms of, of human civilization that are more businesslike or more, might do more harm in some way. Museums in general are more benign, more ethical, more, safe. So every museum has the potential to be more regenerative than they are. I think that the eco museum world is something that I feel hasn't been surfaced very well, because they're very often so local that they don't get a reputation. You know, they're hidden in their local places. And they're probably so small and voluntary run, or more operating a little bit more like social enterprises, that they can't afford to be part of the, you know, the standard museum world. So we don't hear enough about them. I mean, I think that that's the place to start, really, eco museums, to be kind of rehabilitated and promoted, and to enable them to actually, you know, they've got to start, they've been going at it for longer, so could embrace regenerative principles or living systems much more rapidly if they were funded to. Also, I think maybe, you know, sort of natural history museums and zoos potentially are in a position where so many of them are really aware, really critical of the traditional taxonomical way of doing natural history and the unethical ways of doing zoos, you know, and frustrated by their role as, like, you know, come and look at all the marvels of nature, you know, all the weird and wonderful freaks of nature. They really don't want that role anymore. So yeah, I think those are the sectors to start with. But also, you know, the art museums, because maybe that's the place to, you know, art museums just generally don't tackle environmental themes in their programming, apart from landscape. And what if, I mean, the Sainsbury's Centre is actually a great example, because it incorporates world art. You know, it has its biggest collection is ancient and indigenous world art combined with contemporary art. So they're starting to do a lot more contemporary exhibitions that are surfacing voices of the global south and exploring regenerative and adaptive cultures. So the director was at the British Museum, and his last exhibition there was about the Arctic. So that was very much about biocultural relationships, you know, indigenous people and Arctic environments.
Yeah, I think those are very good possibilities of us examining and analyzing what elements these museums have that brings regenerative thinking on the way they're operating. So this was an interview with Bridget Mckenzie, the Climate Museum UK director. And this is meant to be part of research that is being developed by me, the researcher of this project, Lucimara Letelier. It's part of the Museums Studies Master Program at the University of Leicester. And the research is about regenerative museums. So thank you very much for your time, Bridget. I appreciate your contribution. I'm going to update you about the progress and inform you about the report and everything that has been released after this research. So if you are okay with this now, I will stop recording, but thank you very much.
Thank you. That was really interesting. Yeah, thank you. Good questions.